He paraded a six-figure myth. I brought receipts. The word IRS froze him in front of everyone. What followed made them rethink everything. The wine glass slipped from my fingers, shattering against the marble floors. My son's laughter echoed through the restaurant. 27 years old, sitting across from me in his designer suit, mocking everything I'd built with my bare hands. The sound of breaking crystal seemed to slice through the expensive silence of Romano's, where I'd taken him to celebrate what I thought was his business success. But Marcus wasn't celebrating. He was performing. And I was his audience of one, watching my life's work become the punchline to his cruel joke. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening in the comments. You know what's funny about being a plumber, Dad? Marcus said, cutting into his $40 steak with theatrical precision. People actually think it's a real career, like you're some kind of professional instead of just a guy who unclogs toilets for a living. His girlfriend Sarah giggled, covering her mouth with manicured fingers that had never touched anything rougher than Egyptian cotton. I sat there in my best shirt, the navy blue one I'd worn to his college graduation, watching my son transform into someone I didn't recognize. The same boy who used to follow me around job sites, asking endless questions about pipe fittings and water pressure, now looked at me like I was something he'd scrape off his Italian leather shoes. Marcus leaned back in his chair, swirling wine that cost more than most people made in a day. Sarah and I were just discussing career trajectories, weren't we, babe? He reached across the table to squeeze her hand. How some people are content to stay in the service industry their entire lives, while others have the vision and intelligence to build something meaningful. The words hit like ice water in my veins. Service industry. As if 30 years of building Hayes Plumbing from a single van into a company with 18 employees was somehow beneath his notice. As if the money that paid for his private school education, his college tuition, his first car, had materialized from thin air instead of flowing from pipes I'd crawled through at 3 a.m. Sarah nodded enthusiastically, her voice pitched high with artificial sweetness. It's so inspiring to see someone who refuses to settle for mediocrity. Marcus has such ambitious plans for expanding his consulting firm. The way she said consulting firm made it sound like he was running Goldman Sachs instead of whatever it was he actually did in that glass office downtown. I took a sip of my beer, feeling overdressed in this place where appetizers cost what I used to spend on groceries for a week. Marcus had insisted on Romano's, claimed he wanted to treat me to somewhere nice for once. Now I understood it wasn't generosity. It was a stage, a carefully chosen backdrop for his performance of superiority. Tell Dad about the Peterson account, Marcus. Sarah's eyes sparkled with the kind of admiration I'd once seen when Marcus looked at my toolbox, back when he thought fixing things was magic instead of manual labor. Marcus straightened his tie, a gesture I recognized from the little boy who used to practice wearing my work shirts, pretending to be grown up. The Peterson Group is bringing me on as their primary business optimization consultant. 6-figure contract, renewable annually. He paused for effect, watching my face for signs of the impressed reaction he expected. It's the kind of work that actually makes a difference in the world, you know? Strategic thinking, market analysis, real intellectual challenges. Real intellectual challenges. I set down my beer bottle carefully, my hands steadier than I felt. The same hands that had diagnosed problems in 100-year-old buildings, that had prevented water damage that could have cost families their homes, that had worked 16-hour days to keep his world comfortable and clean. Those hands apparently weren't intellectual enough for his new standards. The thing is, Dad, Marcus continued, warming to his theme like a preacher finding his rhythm. I've been thinking about our conversation last month when you suggested I might want to join the family business someday. His laugh was sharp, cutting. Can you imagine? Me crawling around in basements and dealing with other people's waste? I mean, no offense, but I went to Wharton for a reason. No offense. The universal disclaimer that preceded every offensive thing people said when they wanted to wound you without consequences. I watched my son's face, searching for any trace of the boy who used to beg me to let him hold the flashlight while I worked, who'd proudly announced to his second-grade class that his daddy fixed broken things and made them work again. Sarah was nodding along like Marcus was delivering the Gettysburg Address instead of eviscerating his father's life choices in a public restaurant. It takes real courage to break the cycle, she said, her voice dripping with mock sincerity. To rise above your circumstances and create something better for the next generation. Rise above your circumstances. I looked around Romano's, at the crystal chandeliers and marble columns, at the other diners in their expensive clothes discussing their important lives. Everything here screamed money, status, the kind of success that came with clean hands and complicated business cards. The kind of success Marcus thought mattered, but success had different definitions depending on where you stood to measure it. I thought about Mrs. Chen, 83 years old, calling me at midnight last winter because her pipes had burst and flooded her kitchen. I'd driven through a blizzard to fix her plumbing, refusing payment because I knew she lived on Social Security. That was success to me. That was the difference between a job and a calling. You know what the best part is, Dad? Marcus was still talking, still performing for his audience of admirers. I'll never have to worry about job security the way you do. Plumbing is so replaceable, so easily automated. But strategic consulting, that requires human intelligence, creativity, vision. Those are skills that can't be replicated by machines or immigrants willing to work for nothing. The casual cruelty of that last comment made something cold settle in my chest. Immigrants willing to work for nothing. As if Horst and Miguel, who'd worked for me for 8 years, were somehow less valuable because they'd had the courage to start over in a new country. As if their expertise with copper fitting and their willingness to work in conditions Marcus couldn't imagine for 5 minutes made them disposable. I thought about the business records I'd been reviewing just that morning, the quarterly reports I'd been meaning to discuss with Marcus when we had our next family dinner. Hayes Plumbing had grown steadily every year for the past decade. We'd expanded into commercial work, earned certifications that most competitors couldn't match, built relationships with contractors who trusted our work enough to stake their reputations on our quality. But more than the numbers, I thought about the calls we received. The desperate homeowners at 2 a.m, the small business owners whose livelihoods depended on functioning pipes, the elderly customers who trusted us to be honest about what needed fixing and what could wait. We weren't just unclogging toilets, despite what Marcus thought. We were maintaining the invisible infrastructure that kept civilization running smoothly. Sarah raised her wine glass in a mock toast to Marcus and his vision for the future, to success that doesn't require getting your hands dirty. She giggled again, that same tinkling sound that was starting to grate against my nerves like fingernails on copper pipes. Marcus clinked his glass against hers, both of them looking at me expectantly, waiting for me to join their celebration of my own irrelevance. Instead, I pushed back my chair and stood up, feeling every one of my 54 years in the movement. "Where are you going, Dad?" Marcus's voice carried a note of annoyance, as if I was disrupting his carefully orchestrated performance. "We haven't even ordered dessert yet." I pulled out my wallet and placed $200 on the table, more than enough to cover my portion of this expensive humiliation. I looked at my son, really looked at him, searching for any sign of the boy I'd raised to value hard work and respect for others. But all I saw was a stranger in an expensive suit, someone who'd forgotten where he came from and who had paid for him to get where he was going. "I need to make some phone calls," I said quietly. "Business matters. Things you probably wouldn't find intellectually challenging enough to understand." Marcus's face flushed red, the first genuine emotion I'd seen from him all evening. "Dad, don't be dramatic. I was just explaining the difference between our career paths. There's no reason to get upset about facts." Facts. I almost smiled at that. Marcus thought he knew facts, sitting in his glass office pushing papers around and calling it strategy. But I knew facts too. I knew the facts about cash flow and client retention and what happened when businesses built on smoke and mirrors instead of substance finally faced reality. I knew facts about the consulting firm that bore my son's name, but had never shown me a single profit statement or client testimonial. Most importantly, I knew facts about the phone calls I'd been receiving from creditors over the past month, calls asking about Marcus Hayes and his outstanding debts, calls that painted a very different picture of his success than the one he was performing tonight. "Enjoy your dessert," I said, my voice steady despite the storm building in my chest. "We'll talk soon about those intellectual challenges you mentioned. I think you'll find the conversation very educational." I walked out of Romano's into the December night, my breath forming clouds in the cold air, as I pulled out my phone. The parking lot felt like a different world from the warm lighting and false sophistication I'd just escaped. My hands weren't shaking anymore. They were steady, purposeful, the hands of a man who'd finally stopped pretending his son's success was real. The first call went to Jim Patterson, my accountant for the past 15 years. Jim had been handling Hayes Plumbing's books since we were small enough to fit our entire operation in my garage. Now he managed the finances for a company that employed nearly 20 people and generated more revenue than Marcus could imagine. Jim picked up on the second ring, his voice groggy with sleep. "Frank, what's wrong? It's almost 10 o'clock. "Nothing's wrong, Jim. But I need you to pull together all the financial documents from Marcus's consulting firm. Everything we have access to as co-signers on his business accounts. I want profit and loss statements, client payment records, outstanding receivables, the works." There was a pause. "Frank, are you sure about this? It's your son's business. Maybe you should talk to him first before we start digging into his finances." I thought about Marcus's performance at dinner, his casual dismissal of everything I'd built, his girlfriend's mocking laughter. I thought about the creditor calls I'd been fielding for weeks, each one painting a clearer picture of my son's fantasy empire. "Jim, I've been getting calls from collection agencies for 3 weeks. They're looking for Marcus Hayes of Hayes Strategic Consulting, the same Marcus Hayes whose business loan I co-signed 18 months ago, the same business loan that's apparently in default. So no, I don't think I need his permission to understand what I'm liable for." The silence on the other end stretched long enough for me to unlock my truck and slide behind the wheel. Finally, Jim sighed. "I'll have everything ready by morning. Frank, how bad do you think this is?" "Bad enough that my son is spending money he doesn't have on dinners that cost more than his employees make in a day. Bad enough that he's lecturing me about career success while dodging creditors. I'll see you at 8 tomorrow morning." The drive home took 20 minutes through neighborhoods I'd worked in for decades, past the Morrison house where I'd installed their entire plumbing system during their renovation, past the elementary school where I'd donated my services to upgrade their restrooms because the district couldn't afford the repairs, past the senior center where I'd fixed their water heater last month, refusing payment because they used their limited funds to provide meals for elderly residents who had nowhere else to go. This was my real resume. Not the certificates on my office wall or the business license hanging in my shop. This was the work that mattered, the kind of success you couldn't fake or inflate with impressive-sounding job titles. My house sat at the end of Maple Street, a modest 2-story I'd bought 28 years ago when Marcus was born. I'd updated the plumbing myself over the years, turning it into a showcase of what quality work looked like. Every fixture, every pipe, every connection was done right the first time. No shortcuts, no cheap materials, no compromises. Inside, the silence felt different from the oppressive quiet of Romano's. This was honest silence, the kind that came from a day's work finished and a conscience clear. I poured myself a glass of water from the kitchen tap, thinking about the complex network of pipes that brought clean water to my home. Most people never thought about the infrastructure that made their lives possible. They turned handles and expected water to flow, never considering the skill and knowledge required to make that simple miracle happen every single day. My home office occupied what used to be Marcus's bedroom, back when he lived here during college breaks. The walls were lined with industry certifications, photos from job sites, thank you cards from customers whose problems I'd solved. Real testimonials from real people, not the vague corporate speak that filled Marcus's website. I opened my laptop and navigated to Hayes Strategic Consulting's homepage. The site was professionally designed, all clean lines and stock photography of diverse business people shaking hands in glass conference rooms. The services page promised innovative solutions for complex business challenges and strategic guidance for sustainable growth. It sounded impressive until you tried to figure out what any of it actually meant. The About section featured a professional headshot of Marcus in the same suit he'd worn to dinner, his biography emphasizing his Wharton education and extensive experience in market optimization. Extensive experience. He'd been in business for less than 2 years, and most of that time had been spent building his brand instead of serving actual clients. I clicked through to the testimonials page, expecting to find glowing reviews from satisfied customers. Instead, I found 3 generic endorsements that could have been written by anyone about anything. No specific results, no measurable improvements, no detailed explanations of how Marcus's consulting had actually helped their businesses. Just vague praise about his fresh perspective and innovative approach. This was the intellectual challenge Marcus was so proud of. This was the meaningful work that made him superior to his father's trade. A website full of empty promises and a business model built on perception instead of performance. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Probably Marcus, trying to smooth things over now that his performance was finished and he needed to maintain access to his father's resources. I didn't check it. Instead, I opened my filing cabinet and pulled out the folder labeled Marcus Business Loan. The documents told a story very different from the success narrative he'd been selling. 18 months ago, he'd come to me with a business plan that looked impressive on paper. Hayes Strategic Consulting would provide high-level business advice to small and medium-sized companies, helping them optimize their operations and increase profitability. The initial investment of $200,000 would cover office space, equipment, marketing, and operating expenses for the first year. I'd been skeptical, but proud. My son was following in my footsteps, building something from nothing. The difference was that I'd started Hayes Plumbing with $5,000 in a used van, learning the trade through apprenticeships and night school. Marcus wanted to start at the top, with an expensive office and a salary that assumed success before he'd earned his first client. But he was my son, and I wanted to believe in his vision. So I'd co-signed the loan, putting my own business and home as collateral. It seemed like a reasonable risk for a father to take on his child's future. Now, looking at the payment schedule, I could see exactly when things had started going wrong. The first 6 months had been fine, payments made on time, no red flags. Then, the payments had become irregular. 30 days late, then 60, then 90. For the past 4 months, no payments at all. The loan officer had been calling me for weeks, explaining that as co-signer, I was fully responsible for the debt. $200,000 plus interest and penalties. If Marcus couldn't pay, they'd come after Hayes Plumbing. They'd come after my house. They'd destroy everything I'd built to cover my son's failure. I leaned back in my chair, looking at the photos on my wall. Pictures of successful projects, satisfied customers, my crew celebrating after completing a particularly challenging job. This was real success. This was the kind of work that created value instead of just moving money around on spreadsheets. But Marcus didn't see it that way. To him, I was just a plumber, someone who got his hands dirty for a living. He couldn't understand that dirty hands often belong to the people who actually built things, who solved problems, who made the world work. My phone rang again, Marcus's name flashing on the screen. This time I answered, my voice calm despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. Dad, look, I think there might have been some misunderstanding at dinner tonight. You seemed upset about something, but I was just trying to explain the different paths our careers have taken. There's nothing wrong with being a plumber. It's honest work. Honest work. The condescension dripped through the phone line like water through a cracked pipe. You're right, Marcus. It is honest work, which is more than I can say about your business. What's that supposed to mean? It means I know about the loan payments you've been missing. It means I know about the creditors calling my house looking for you. It means I know the difference between real success and the performance you put on tonight. The silence stretched long enough for me to hear Sarah's voice in the background, asking what was wrong. Finally, Marcus spoke, his voice tight with something that might have been fear. Dad, business has been a little slow lately, but that's normal for a new company. I've got several big contracts in the pipeline. The Peterson Group deal I mentioned is going to change everything. The Peterson Group. I'd heard that name before, but not in the context Marcus thought. Peterson Construction had been one of my clients for 15 years. Tom Peterson was a straight shooter who valued quality work and fair pricing. If Marcus was really working with them, Tom would have mentioned it. Is that right? Well, since the Peterson Group is such an important client, maybe we should all have dinner together. I know Tom Peterson pretty well. We could discuss business. Another pause, longer this time. I could almost hear the wheels turning in Marcus's head, trying to figure out how to maintain his fiction when reality was closing in. That's not really necessary, Dad. Business relationships need to be kept separate from family matters. You understand? Oh, I understand perfectly, Marcus. I understand that your intellectual challenges are about to become very real. I understand that your strategic consulting firm exists mainly in your marketing materials. And I understand that tomorrow morning, you and I are going to have a very different conversation about career success. The line went dead. Marcus had hung up rather than continue a conversation where his lies were being exposed. But ending the call wouldn't end the problem. Tomorrow, when Jim showed me the full scope of my son's financial disaster, the real conversation would begin. I looked out my office window at the quiet street, thinking about the families sleeping peacefully in houses where the plumbing worked, where the water flowed clean and the waste disappeared without thought or worry. Invisible infrastructure that made their lives possible, maintained by people like me who understood that some work was too important for pride or pretension. Tomorrow, Marcus would learn that his father's honest work had been subsidizing his dishonest business all along. He'd learn that intellectual challenges weren't about impressing people with complicated vocabulary. They were about solving real problems for real people with real consequences for failure. Most importantly, he'd learn that the man he'd mocked tonight held the power to expose everything he'd been trying so desperately to hide. The performance was over. Now came the reckoning. The next morning arrived with the kind of December frost that made pipes vulnerable and plumbers essential. I was at my office by 7, reviewing the documents Jim had promised to compile. Hayes Plumbing's financial records told a story of steady growth built on reputation and reliability. 23 years of profit, expanding every year through referrals and repeat customers who trusted our work. Marcus's records told a different story entirely. Jim Patterson arrived at 8 sharp, carrying a manila folder thick enough to choke a horse. His expression was grim as he settled into the chair across from my desk, the same chair where Marcus used to sit during high school, asking me to explain business concepts he claimed to find fascinating back then. Frank, I've got to be honest with you. This is worse than I expected. Jim opened the folder and spread documents across my desk like crime scene evidence. Your son's company has exactly 4 clients on record. 4. And 2 of them haven't paid their invoices in over 6 months. I picked up the client list, recognizing none of the names except for a small marketing firm that had gone out of business 3 months ago. Where's the Peterson Group contract he was bragging about last night? There is no Peterson Group contract. Jim pulled out a communication log showing months of unreturned calls and emails. Marcus has been pursuing them for 8 months, but they've never responded to any of his proposals. Tom Peterson's assistant finally told him to stop calling. The revelation hit like ice water through copper pipes. My son had built his entire persona around a contract that existed only in his imagination. The expensive dinners, the designer clothes, the condescending lectures about intellectual challenges, all of it funded by borrowed money and subsidized by his father's reputation. What about revenue? Surely he's generated some income over the past 2 years. Jim flipped to another page, his finger tracing columns of numbers that painted an increasingly bleak picture. Total revenue for Hayes Strategic Consulting over 24 months of operation, $37,000. Total expenses in the same period, $193,000. I sat back in my chair, the magnitude of Marcus's deception settling over me like morning fog. He'd burned through nearly $200,000 while generating barely enough income to cover his monthly car payment. The math was so lopsided, it would have been comical if it weren't destroying my financial future along with his. The worst part, Frank, is that most of the expenses aren't even business-related. Jim showed me credit card statements filled with charges from high-end restaurants, clothing stores, and luxury hotels. He's been living like a millionaire on borrowed money, using the business accounts like personal piggy banks. I thought about dinner at Romano's, about Marcus casually ordering wine that cost more than my plumber's made in a day, about his girlfriend's designer handbag and their casual discussion of vacation plans. All of it purchased with money that didn't exist, funded by loans that would ultimately fall on my shoulders to repay. There's more, Jim continued, his voice dropping to the tone reserved for delivering terminal diagnoses. The IRS has been trying to reach him about unpaid payroll taxes. When you don't have employees but claim them on your tax returns, they tend to notice. We're looking at potential fraud charges here, Frank. Fraud charges. The word hung in the air like smoke from an electrical fire, acrid and dangerous. My son hadn't just failed at business, he'd crossed lines that could land him in federal prison, dragging my company's reputation down with him. How much exposure do I have as the co-signer? The question came out steadier than I felt, the voice of a businessman who'd faced tough decisions before, even when they involved family. Jim pulled out a calculator and started adding figures with the methodical precision of a man who'd delivered bad news to small business owners for decades. The original loan balance, plus accrued interest and penalties, comes to $238,000. The unpaid taxes add another $47,000. If the IRS decides to pursue fraud charges, we could be looking at fines that double or triple that amount. Nearly $300,000, more than Hayes Plumbing's annual profit, enough to destroy the company I'd built pipe by pipe over 3 decades. I looked around my office at the certificates on the walls, the thank you letters from satisfied customers, the photos of projects that had required real skill and generated actual value. All of it at risk because I'd trusted my son's vision of intellectual superiority. My phone buzzed with a text message. Marcus again, probably wondering why I wasn't returning his calls, why the cleanup conversation he expected wasn't happening on his timeline. I turned the phone face down and focused on Jim's grim assessment. What are my options? Can I separate Hayes Plumbing from his debts? Jim shook his head slowly. You co-signed everything, Frank. In the eyes of the law, you're equally responsible for every dollar. They can come after your business, your house, your personal assets. The only protection you'd have is bankruptcy, and that would destroy everything you've built. Bankruptcy. The ultimate failure for a man who'd prided himself on paying every bill on time, on building something solid and lasting. The irony was bitter as copper pipes left too long in acidic water. My son's intellectual challenges had created problems that honest work couldn't solve. But there was another option, one that Jim hadn't mentioned because it required a harder kind of thinking than adding numbers on spreadsheets. Marcus had spent 2 years building an elaborate fiction about his success, using my reputation and resources to fund his fantasy. Maybe it was time to use his fiction against him. Jim, I need you to do something else for me. I want you to prepare a complete financial analysis of Hayes Strategic Consulting, everything we've just discussed, but formatted like the kind of report that gets presented to boards of directors. Professional, detailed, impossible to dismiss or ignore. What are you planning, Frank? Jim's expression showed the concern of a man who'd watched too many family businesses destroyed by personal grudges. I'm planning to have a conversation with my son about the difference between real success and performance art, about what happens when intellectual challenges meet actual consequences, about the cost of treating family like fools who exist to fund your delusions of grandeur. The truth was, I'd been enabling Marcus's behavior for years without realizing it. Every time I'd praised his ambition without asking for specifics, every time I'd co-signed documents without demanding transparency, every time I'd accepted his vague explanations about business development and market penetration, I'd been complicit in building the foundation for this disaster. But enablement worked both ways. Marcus had been relying on his father's reputation and resources to maintain his lifestyle, assuming that family loyalty would protect him from the consequences of his choices. He'd calculated that I'd be too proud or too protective to expose his failures publicly. He was about to learn that calculation was wrong. My phone rang again, this time showing Sarah's number instead of Marcus's. Interesting. Apparently my son was delegating the cleanup conversation to his girlfriend, another sign that he still didn't understand the seriousness of his situation. Mr. Hayes? Sarah's voice carried the same artificial sweetness I'd heard at dinner, but with an underlying tension that suggested she was beginning to grasp the reality behind Marcus's performance. Marcus is really worried about how you two left things last night. He thinks there might have been some miscommunication. Miscommunication. That was one way to describe my son's systematic deception about his business success. Another way would be fraud, but Sarah probably wasn't ready for that level of honesty yet. Sarah, where is Marcus right now? Is he at his office? A pause. He's actually at home today. He's been feeling a bit under the weather lately. The stress of managing such a successful consulting firm, You know how it is, under the weather. More likely, he was hiding from creditors and trying to figure out how to maintain his fiction now that his father had started asking uncomfortable questions. But Sarah's continued belief in his success story gave me an idea. That's too bad. I was hoping to surprise him at his office this afternoon. I wanted to see the Peterson Group contract he was telling me about. Maybe meet some of his staff, get a better understanding of what strategic consulting actually involves. Oh, well, I don't think that would be a good idea today. You know how it is with client confidentiality and all. Maybe we could arrange something for next week? Client confidentiality. The same excuse Marcus had used when I'd suggested dinner with Tom Peterson. These people had built an entire vocabulary around avoiding specifics, using professional-sounding terms to disguise the fact that there was nothing professional to discuss. Actually, Sarah, I think today would be perfect. In fact, I think Marcus's entire team should be there. His employees, his clients, maybe even some potential investors. We could make it a real celebration of his success. The silence on the other end stretched long enough for me to hear the doubt creeping into Sarah's voice when she finally spoke. Mr. Hayes, I'm not sure Marcus would be comfortable with that kind of surprise. He likes to plan these things carefully. I'm sure he does. But sometimes the best celebrations are spontaneous. Why don't you tell Marcus that I'll be at his office at 2 o'clock this afternoon? If he's too sick to be there himself, maybe his staff can give me a tour of the operation. I ended the call before Sarah could come up with more excuses, then turned back to Jim, who'd been listening with growing understanding. You're going to expose him publicly, aren't you? Jim's voice carried a mixture of admiration and concern. Frank, he's your son. Are you sure about this? I looked at the financial documents spread across my desk, at the evidence of Marcus's systematic deception and the debt that threatened everything I'd built. Then, I looked at the photos on my wall, reminders of honest work done for honest pay, of problems solved and value created. Jim, for 30 years, I've built my reputation on doing what I said I'd do, charging what the work was worth, and standing behind every job. My son has spent 2 years doing the opposite, building his reputation on lies and funding it with money he can't pay back. Maybe it's time he learned what real consequences look like. The plan that formed in my mind over the next hour was simple but comprehensive. Marcus had been using my reputation as collateral for his fantasy business. Now I'd use his fantasy against him, in front of the audience he'd been trying so hard to impress. By the time I left my office that morning, I'd made 6 phone calls that would change everything. The first was to Tom Peterson, confirming what I already suspected about Marcus's fictional contract. The second was to a private investigator who specialized in business fraud cases. The third was to my lawyer, explaining the situation and requesting emergency protection for Hayes Plumbing's assets. The fourth call was to Marcus's landlord, inquiring about the status of his office lease payments. The fifth was to the local business journal, suggesting they might be interested in a story about successful father-son business partnerships in the Spokane area. The sixth call was to my crew chief, asking him to clear his schedule for an afternoon field trip to a strategic consulting firm downtown. Educational purposes, I explained. Time for my plumbers to see what intellectual challenges looked like up close. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, Marcus would discover that his father's honest work had taught him more about strategy than any business school could. He'd learned that real success couldn't be faked or financed, only earned through competence and integrity. Most importantly, he'd learned that the man he'd dismissed as intellectually inferior had been several moves ahead all along, building a case that would expose every lie he'd told and every dollar he'd stolen. The performance at Romano's had been impressive, but this afternoon's show would be unforgettable. And this time, Marcus wouldn't be directing the script. The drive to Marcus's office took 15 minutes through downtown Spokane, past buildings where I'd installed plumbing systems that were still running perfectly decades later. Real infrastructure, built to last, maintained by people who understood that shortcuts always cost more in the long run. Unlike the glass tower where my son had been playing businessman for the past 2 years, Marcus's consulting firm occupied a corner suite on the 14th floor, the kind of impressive address that looked good on business cards but cost more per month than most of my employees made. I'd visited once when he first signed the lease, back when I still believed his projections about rapid growth and expanding client base. The office had seemed too large then for a one-man operation. Now I understood it was part of the performance, another prop in his elaborate fiction. I parked across the street and waited, watching the building entrance while reviewing the documents Jim had prepared. The financial analysis read like an autopsy report, dissecting the corpse of Marcus's business dreams with clinical precision. Revenue versus expenses, assets versus liabilities, projections versus reality. Every number told the same story of a man living beyond his means on borrowed time and other people's money. At exactly 2 o'clock, I walked into the marble lobby and took the elevator to the 14th floor. The Hayes Strategic Consulting Office occupied Suite 1420, its frosted glass door etched with a logo that had probably cost more than my first work truck. I pushed through the entrance and found myself in a reception area that looked like something from a magazine spread about successful businesses. Leather furniture arranged around a glass coffee table loaded with business journals. Abstract art on the walls that meant nothing but looked expensive. A receptionist's desk with no receptionist, which should have been my first clue about the state of Marcus's operation. The whole space felt sterile, disconnected from any actual work being done. Marcus emerged from the inner office looking like he'd aged 5 years since dinner the night before. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his tie loosened, dark circles under his eyes suggesting he'd spent the night trying to figure out damage control instead of sleeping. Behind him trailed Sarah, her designer outfit perfectly coordinated, but her expression showing cracks in the confidence she'd displayed at Romano's. "Dad? What are you doing here?" Marcus's voice carried the forced cheerfulness of someone trying to maintain control while everything collapsed around him. "Sarah said you wanted to visit the office, but I told her I was feeling under the weather today. Maybe we could reschedule for next week." I looked around the empty reception area, noting the silence where busy employees should have been taking calls, managing schedules, generating the revenue that supposedly justified this expensive operation. No sounds of productivity, no evidence of the intellectual challenges Marcus had been bragging about. "Actually, I'm feeling much better now that I'm here." "This is quite an impressive setup you have, son. Must cost a fortune to maintain all this." I gestured toward the leather furniture, the imported marble flooring, the floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the city, the kind of overhead that required substantial monthly revenue to justify. Marcus shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances with Sarah that spoke volumes about conversations they'd been having since my phone call. "Well, you know what they say about the importance of professional image in consulting. Clients expect a certain level of sophistication when they're paying for strategic advice." Strategic advice. The phrase had become meaningless through repetition, a verbal smokescreen designed to obscure the fact that no one could explain what Marcus actually did for his clients. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to the notes I'd made during my conversation with Tom Peterson. Speaking of clients, I had an interesting chat with Tom Peterson this morning. You remember Tom, don't you? Peterson Construction, the company you've been telling everyone about. The big contract that's going to change everything for Hayes Strategic Consulting? The color drained from Marcus's face like water from a punctured pipe. "Dad, I told you, business relationships need to remain confidential. I can't discuss specific client details, even with family." "Of course you can't. Because Tom Peterson told me he's never heard of Hayes Strategic Consulting. His assistant said you've been calling for months, but they stopped taking your calls after the third proposal was rejected. Apparently, they found your strategic advice insufficiently strategic." Sarah stepped closer to Marcus, her hand finding his arm in a gesture that looked protective, but felt desperate. "Mr. Hayes, I think there might be some confusion here. Marcus has been working very hard to build relationships with potential clients. Sometimes these things take time to develop." Time to develop. Another euphemism from the vocabulary of business failure, designed to make persistent rejection sound like patient relationship building. I looked at Sarah's face, wondering how much she actually knew about Marcus's financial situation, whether she was complicit in his deception or just another victim of his performance. The elevator chimed behind me, and I turned to see 3 men in work clothes stepping into the reception area. My crew chief Danny, along with Mike and Rodriguez, 2 of my most experienced plumbers. They looked around the fancy office with the kind of polite bewilderment that working people showed when confronted with spaces designed more for impression than function. "Marcus, I'd like you to meet some of my employees. I thought they might be interested in seeing what strategic consulting looks like up close. Maybe you could explain to them how intellectual challenges work in the modern business environment." Marcus stared at my crew like they were exotic animals that had wandered into his natural habitat. Danny, Mike, and Rodriguez stood quietly, taking in the expensive furniture and abstract art with the measured assessment of men who understood the difference between cost and value. "Dad, this really isn't appropriate. My office isn't set up for tours, and I have client calls scheduled this afternoon." Marcus's voice had risen half an octave, the sound of a man realizing his carefully constructed world was about to be examined by people who built things with their hands instead of promises. "Client calls." I pulled out the financial report Jim had prepared and set it on the glass coffee table where the business magazines had been arranged for maximum visual impact. "According to these records, you have exactly 2 active clients, and neither of them has paid an invoice in over 4 months. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah looked at Marcus with growing confusion, as if seeing him clearly for the first time. Danny, Mike, and Rodriguez maintained their professional composure, but I could see them processing the implications of what they'd just heard. Marcus made one last desperate attempt to maintain his fiction. "Those records are private business information. You have no right to access confidential financial data without my permission. I do when I'm the co-signer on every loan, every lease, every credit line that's keeping this place running." I picked up the report and flipped to the first page, where Jim had summarized the key findings in language anyone could understand. "Hayes Strategic Consulting has generated $37,000 in revenue over 2 years of operation, while accumulating debts of nearly $300,000. Danny whistled low under his breath, the sound a plumber made when assessing damage that couldn't be fixed with standard tools. Rodriguez shook his head slowly, recognizing the mathematics of business failure from his own family's experience with failed ventures. Sarah's voice came out small and confused. "Marcus, what is he talking about? You said the business was doing well. You said the Peterson contract was going to make us rich." Marcus's carefully maintained facade finally cracked completely. "The Peterson contract is still in negotiation. These things take time in the corporate world. You wouldn't understand the complexity of high-level strategic planning. Still in negotiation." Tom Peterson's assistant had been very clear about their position on Marcus's proposals. They'd stopped being polite about their rejections 6 months ago. But Marcus had built his entire identity around potential success rather than actual achievement. I looked at my son, really looked at him, seeing past the expensive clothes and professional styling to the frightened young man underneath. He'd painted himself into a corner with lies that had grown too elaborate to maintain, debts too large to service, and expectations too high to meet. The intellectual challenges he'd been so proud of had turned into problems he couldn't think his way out of. "Marcus," I said quietly, "let me explain something about real business to you. When I started Hayes Plumbing, I had $5,000 in a used van. No fancy office, no leather furniture, no strategic planning sessions, just tools, skills, and the willingness to solve problems for people who needed help." My crew nodded in recognition. They'd all started the same way, learning trades that required competence instead of credentials, building reputations through results instead of marketing materials. Every job we took, we had to deliver what we promised. Every customer we served, we had to earn their trust through quality work at fair prices. Every employee we hired, we had to generate enough real revenue to pay their salaries. There were no shortcuts, no performance art, no borrowed credibility. I gestured around the expensive office space, at the props Marcus had assembled to support his consulting fantasy. "This isn't a business, son. It's a stage set. You've been acting the part of a successful entrepreneur while spending money you didn't have on an audience that wasn't buying tickets." Sarah was staring at Marcus with the expression of someone watching a magic trick explained, seeing how the illusion had been constructed and maintained. All those expensive dinners, all those designer clothes, all those confident predictions about future success, suddenly recontextualized as performance rather than reality. The elevator chimed again, and this time Jim Patterson emerged, carrying another manila folder that I recognized as the complete forensic analysis we'd discussed. His expression was grim as he took in the scene: the expensive office, the uncomfortable silence, the evidence of a business built on borrowed money and borrowed time. "Frank, I've got the rest of the documentation you requested." Jim's voice carried the professional neutrality he used when delivering bad news to clients who'd been avoiding reality for too long. "The IRS liaison called this morning. They want to schedule a meeting about the discrepancies in Hayes Strategic Consulting's tax returns." Marcus's face went white as paper. The IRS. The three letters that struck fear into anyone who'd been playing fast and loose with business finances. The government agency that didn't accept excuses about market development or strategic positioning when payroll taxes went unpaid. What discrepancies? Sarah's voice had gone quiet, the sound of someone beginning to understand that her boyfriend's success story was more fiction than fact. Jim opened his folder and pulled out copies of tax documents that painted a clear picture of systematic deception. Hayes Strategic Consulting claimed to have 12 employees and monthly payroll expenses of $43,000. But according to bank records, no payroll taxes were ever paid, and no employee paychecks were ever issued. "Ghost employees," I explained to my crew, who were listening with the fascination of men watching someone else's disaster unfold. Marcus claimed to have a full staff to justify his business expenses, but the employees never existed. It's a common fraud scheme among people who think they're smarter than the system. Danny, Mike, and Rodriguez exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their opinion of people who stole from the government while honest workers paid their taxes every payday. Their respect for Marcus, never high to begin with, evaporated completely. "The really interesting part," Jim continued, "is that most of the claimed business expenses were personal purchases. Restaurants, clothing stores, luxury hotels, even a Caribbean vacation last spring, all charged to the business accounts as consulting-related expenses." Marcus finally found his voice, though it came out strangled and desperate. "Dad, you're humiliating me in front of strangers. This is a private family matter. We should discuss this at home, not in my office." "Your office." I looked around the expensive space that my credit history had helped him secure, at the furniture purchased with borrowed money, at the stage set he'd constructed to support his fiction. "This office exists because I co-signed your lease. The furniture exists because I guaranteed your credit line. The business exists because my reputation convinced the bank to loan you money you could never pay back." Sarah was backing toward the door, her designer heels clicking against the marble floor like a countdown timer. The revelation about ghost employees and fraudulent tax returns had shattered whatever remained of her belief in Marcus's success story. Her face showed the particular devastation that came from realizing you'd been living inside someone else's elaborate lie. "I'm calling my father," she announced, her voice shaking with something between anger and panic. "He's a tax attorney. He warned me about getting involved with small business owners who might cut corners. Marcus, if the IRS is investigating you for fraud, I can't be associated with this." Marcus watched his girlfriend flee toward the elevator, probably calculating how quickly word would spread through their social circle about his fictional empire. Sarah came from the kind of family that valued reputation above all else. Her father's law firm wouldn't want any connection to someone under federal investigation, no matter how promising their strategic consulting had seemed at dinner parties. The elevator doors closed behind her with a soft ding that sounded like a period at the end of a sentence. Sarah's departure left Marcus alone with his father, 3 working men who'd seen through his performance immediately, and 2 accountants who'd documented every dollar of his deception. Marcus slumped into one of his expensive leather chairs, the fight finally draining out of him like water from a broken pipe. "Dad, I never meant for things to go this far. It started small, just using the business accounts for a few personal expenses when cash flow was tight. But then clients started demanding results I couldn't deliver, and I had to maintain appearances while I figured out how to turn things around." Maintain appearances. Even in confession, Marcus couldn't quite abandon the language of performance and image management. He still thought his problems were about perception rather than competence, about marketing rather than actually delivering value to customers. Danny stepped forward, his voice carrying the patient tone he used when explaining complex repairs to homeowners who'd tried to fix things themselves. "Son, let me tell you something about cash flow. When we finish a job, we send an invoice. When the customer pays the invoice, we have cash flow. When we don't finish jobs or customers don't pay, we don't eat. It's that simple. Mike nodded in agreement. We don't get to charge personal dinners to the company because we're having cash flow problems. We get second jobs, we work overtime, we find ways to generate actual revenue instead of moving debt around on paper. Rodriguez, who'd started his own small electrical business before joining my crew, looked around the office with the expression of someone calculating overhead costs. This place probably runs $15,000 a month just in rent and utilities. You'd need to bill $60,000 monthly just to break even, assuming you could collect on every invoice. The mathematics of Marcus's failure were becoming clear to everyone except Marcus himself. He'd been playing businessman in an office that required the revenue of an established firm, spending money like a successful consultant while generating income like someone just starting out. Jim pulled out another document from his folder, this one stamped with official seals that made Marcus flinch visibly. The bank has initiated foreclosure proceedings on the business loan. Since you're personally guaranteed as the co-signer, Frank, they're requiring immediate payment of the full balance plus penalties. We have 14 days to come up with $238,000. 14 days. I looked at my son, sitting in his leather chair surrounded by the props of his failed performance, and felt something shift inside me. Not anger anymore, but the cold clarity that came with accepting an unpleasant truth. Marcus had gambled my life's work on his fantasy, and now the bill was due. What about the house? Marcus asked quietly. Could we refinance the house to cover the loan? The house I'd paid off 5 years ago through 30 years of steady work, where I'd raised him, where his mother had lived before cancer took her. The house that represented everything I'd built through honest labor, now at risk because my son had chosen fiction over reality. Marcus, I said, my voice steady despite the storm building in my chest, let me explain something to you about consequences. When you co-sign a loan, you're not just guaranteeing money. You're guaranteeing that if the borrower fails, you'll lose everything you've worked for to cover their mistakes. He looked up at me with something that might have been hope. So you'll help me figure this out? We can restructure the debt, maybe bring in investors, turn the business around? Still thinking like a performer instead of a businessman. Still believing that the right combination of words and optimistic projections could transform failure into success. Still assuming that his father would sacrifice everything to maintain his son's illusion of competence. No, Marcus, I'm not going to refinance my house to pay for your fraud. I'm not going to destroy Hayes Plumbing to cover your debts. I'm not going to enable your delusions anymore. The words hung in the air like smoke from an electrical fire, acrid and final. Danny, Mike, and Rodriguez maintained their professional silence, but I could see their approval in their expressions. These were men who understood accountability, who knew that real success required facing consequences rather than avoiding them. Marcus's face crumpled like paper in water. Then what am I supposed to do? I can't pay back $200,000. I don't have any real clients. I don't even know how to do actual consulting work. Everything I told people about my business was just things I read in books and articles. For the first time since this disaster began, Marcus was telling the truth. No performance, no strategic vocabulary, just honest admission that he'd been faking competence he'd never developed. It was almost refreshing to hear him speak plainly after years of corporate double talk. What you're supposed to do, I said, is learn what every other adult learns when they make mistakes. You face the consequences, you take responsibility, and you figure out how to rebuild from whatever's left. But I don't know how to do anything real. Marcus's voice broke slightly. I spent so much time learning to sound successful that I never learned to actually be successful. How am I supposed to start over when I've never really started at all? The question revealed the core problem that had been hiding beneath all of Marcus's deceptions. He'd skipped the apprenticeship phase that every real business required, the years of learning skills, building relationships, and earning credibility through small successes. He'd tried to begin at the top of a ladder he'd never climbed. Rodriguez stepped forward, his voice carrying the wisdom of someone who'd built something real from nothing. Brother, let me tell you what my father told me when I was your age and thought I knew everything. He said, Mijo, you can't harvest what you never planted. You can't build on a foundation you never laid. and you can't skip the work just because you don't like how it looks. The simple truth of those words hit harder than any business school lecture about market strategy or competitive advantage. Marcus had tried to harvest success without planting competence, to build a business without laying the foundation of actual skills and genuine relationships. Jim cleared his throat, drawing attention back to the practical realities of Marcus's situation. "Frank, we need to discuss immediate next steps. The IRS meeting is scheduled for next week. The bank wants their money in 14 days. Hayes Strategic Consulting's creditors are starting to file liens against the business assets." I looked around the expensive office one more time, seeing it clearly for what it really was. Evidence of my son's elaborate self-deception, purchased with money he'd never earned and sustained by lies he'd never been forced to confront. The leather furniture, the abstract art, the panoramic windows, all of it would be seized and sold to pay debts Marcus could never service. "Jim, I want you to begin bankruptcy proceedings for Hayes Strategic Consulting immediately. Liquidate everything, settle what debts we can, and protect Hayes Plumbing's assets from any further exposure." Marcus looked up sharply. "You're destroying my business? Your business destroyed itself the day you decided performance was more important than competence. I'm just acknowledging reality instead of enabling your fantasy." The elevator chimed again, and Tom Peterson stepped into the reception area, his weathered face taking in the scene with the quick assessment of a contractor who'd seen every kind of business disaster over 40 years in construction. I'd called him during the drive over, explaining that my son had been using Peterson Construction's name inappropriately and inviting him to see the consequences firsthand. "Frank, good to see you." Tom's handshake was firm, honest, the grip of a man who'd built his reputation through decades of delivering what he promised. "This must be your boy Marcus, the one who's been calling my office about consulting contracts." Marcus shrank deeper into his chair, probably wishing the expensive leather could swallow him entirely. The man whose approval he'd been desperately seeking for months was now witnessing the complete collapse of his professional facade. Tom looked around the office with the practiced eye of someone who understood the relationship between overhead costs and revenue generation. "Son, I've got to ask, how many legitimate clients are you actually serving out of this setup?" The question hung in the air like a challenge Marcus couldn't meet. His mouth opened and closed silently, searching for an answer that wouldn't expose the complete emptiness of his business model. "He doesn't have any real clients," I answered for him. "The whole operation is funded by loans I guaranteed, sustained by lies he's been telling anyone who would listen, including family members who should have known better." Tom nodded slowly, the expression of a man who'd seen promising young entrepreneurs destroy themselves through arrogance and dishonesty. "Marcus, let me give you some free advice, since you seem to be in the consulting business. Real success isn't about impressing people with expensive offices and fancy vocabulary. It's about solving problems for customers who are willing to pay for solutions that actually work." The simple wisdom in Tom's words highlighted everything wrong with Marcus's approach to business. He'd focused on creating the appearance of success rather than the substance, on building a brand rather than building competence, on managing perceptions rather than delivering results. My phone buzzed with a text message from Sarah, probably trying to distance herself from Marcus's legal troubles as quickly as possible. I didn't check it. Instead, I looked at my son, sitting in his collapsing empire, finally understanding that his intellectual challenges had been nothing more than expensive delusions. "Marcus," I said quietly, "tomorrow morning you're going to start learning what real work looks like. You're going to come to Hayes Plumbing at 6 a.m., put on work clothes that can get dirty, and spend the day helping my crew with actual jobs that solve actual problems for actual customers." His face showed horror at the prospect of manual labor, of getting his hands dirty with the kind of work he'd dismissed as intellectually inferior. But what choice did he have? His consulting career was over, his girlfriend had fled, his business was heading for bankruptcy court, and his father's patience had finally run out. "You want me to be a plumber?" The question came out like he was asking about joining a leper colony. "I want you to learn the difference between work that creates value and work that just moves money around on spreadsheets. I want you to understand why dirty hands often belong to people who actually build things, fix things, make things work better than they found them. Danny, Mike, and Rodriguez exchanged glances that suggested they weren't entirely thrilled about babysitting the boss's son, especially one who demonstrated such contempt for their profession. But they were good men who understood that everyone deserved a chance to learn, even spoiled business school graduates who'd forgotten that pride came after accomplishment, not before. The meeting was over. Marcus's performance had ended, his audience had seen through the illusion, and the real work of rebuilding from the wreckage was about to begin. Whether he'd learn anything from the experience remained to be seen, but at least he'd finally have the chance to discover what his father had been trying to teach him all along. Success wasn't about the size of your office or the complexity of your vocabulary. It was about competence, integrity, and the willingness to serve others better than they could serve themselves. Everything else was just expensive theater, and the curtain had finally fallen on Marcus's long-running show. As we rode the elevator down from the 14th floor, I felt lighter than I had in years. The burden of enabling my son's delusions was finally lifted. Tomorrow, we'd find out if Marcus Hayes had what it took to become the man his father had tried to raise him to be. The intellectual challenges were just beginning. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.